Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating source text that completely deconstructs atheism. We're going to unpack its linguistic origins, the modern categories of non-belief, and its pretty surprising historical evolution. So if you've ever been curious about how the concept of atheism was actually formed over the centuries, let's jump right in.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll cover linguistic versus modern definitions, the categories of non-religion, the historical shift, and finally, the 19th century pioneers.
All right, starting off with Section 1, Linguistic versus Modern Definitions.
So, the source text points out a massive disconnect here that we really need to understand. Linguistically, the Arabic root for atheism is al-mail, and that simply means to incline or deviate from a path. It's a pretty broad concept, right? But the modern terminological definition? Well, that's much more rigid. Today, it specifically demands the absolute, outright denial of a creator, the unseen, and resurrection.
This actually makes a crucial point about historical context. Back in the day, when ancient texts labeled someone an atheist, they usually just meant that the person had deviated on some very specific, nuanced theological details. For example, the famous philosopher Ibn Sina was sometimes slapped with this label by early scholars. But here's the kicker. He didn't completely deny God's existence at all. He just held some unorthodox views on specific attributes of God. This absolutely matters, because if we don't understand this linguistic shift, we end up completely misreading historical texts through our modern lens.
Moving right along to Section 2, the divisions of modern irreligion.
You know, according to the source material, modern non-religion isn't just one big monolith. It's actually broken down into 5 very distinct categories. The text identifies them as the humanist, the apathetic, the agnostic, the deist, and finally, the atheist. Let's quickly break down what each of these actually means in practice.
Starting off with the humanist, this worldview is solely concerned with human affairs and human-centric values, basically ignoring the divine altogether. Then, in contrast, you have the agnostic. They are completely suspended in a state of doubt. They argue they literally just cannot confirm or deny the existence of a creator, so they remain entirely uncommitted.
Moving further along the spectrum, a deist actually does believe in a creator who made the world, but they entirely reject organized religion. They kind of view it as a trap. And then conversely, you have the strict atheist, who outright denies any unseen religious realities or divine beings whatsoever. Now, the author notes a really vital distinction here that we absolutely need to keep in mind. While society might loosely group all 5 of these categories together under the general umbrella of irreligion, or even call them all atheists, only that final category, the strict atheist, truly fits the modern terminological definition of atheism that we established at the very beginning of this explainer.
Which brings us to Section 3, the historical shift.
The source maps out this fascinating chronological timeline for us. It shows how humanity went from an almost universal, unquestioned belief in a creator prior to the 18th century, straight into an era of deep textual doubt during the Enlightenment, which then finally culminated in the formalization of modern atheism in the 19th century.
To really drive home just how sudden and unprecedented this modern shift was, the text brings in a quote from the renowned historian Will Durant. He essentially points out that throughout the vast, sweeping history of the human race, outright atheism was practically non-existent. Human civilization has overwhelmingly been founded on the core belief in a creator.
So how did this massive shift actually happen? Well, the text argues that the real gateway to modern atheism began in 18th century Europe. And fascinatingly, it didn't start with outright denial. Actually, it started with something called ta'wil, which is the intentional distortion or hyper-reinterpretation of religious texts. By constantly twisting the literal meanings of Scripture, this intellectual trend slowly eroded the public's trust in religion itself, which ultimately paved the way for full-blown secularism.
And there's this great paradox that perfectly highlights the era's attitude. Voltaire was famously one of the most vicious rebels against the European Church, but the text notes even he wasn't an atheist. He fully believed a creator existed, but argued that religion was just a necessary social tool, literally so his servants would have the morals not to steal from him. So the 18th century was really about doubting the institution, not the creator.
Okay, let's jump into Section 4, the 19th century pioneers.
The author identifies 3 specific men as the true architects of modern atheism. And what's really amazing here is that each of them attacked religion from a completely different academic angle. Karl Marx approached it through economics, arguing religion would just naturally vanish once class struggles ended. Charles Darwin approached it through biology with his theories on evolution. And Emil Durkheim, he approached it through sociology, arguing that religion was nothing more than a man-made societal construct.
The text actually spends a good chunk of time critiquing Durkheim's sociological theory in particular. Durkheim pushed the totem theory, this idea that early religion simply originated from primitive tribes worshipping their animal symbols, or totems. But the source counters this pretty hard. It argues that totems were actually just tribal identifiers. Think of them like a modern national flag or an economic marker. It asserts that Durkheim totally mischaracterized them, arguing that religion at its core is an individual relationship, not merely some collective social invention.
But wait, it gets crazier. The author notes that much of Durkheim's theory actually relied on fabricated anthropological data. According to the text, Durkheim used sensationalized, entirely false reports about primitive tribal orgies and chaotic behaviors to paint the origins of religion as some sort of societal rebellion. The text claims this data has since been widely discredited, which obviously makes his foundational conclusions incredibly weak.
Ultimately, the source concludes that Marx, Darwin, and Durkheim effectively smuggled flawed and heavily biased concepts into the European consciousness. By presenting these specific theories as absolute facts, the text argues that they accidentally but directly birthed the modern atheistic worldview. So according to this analysis, the entire modern movement of atheism is actually built on these shaky 19th century foundational claims.
And that brings us to the end of our breakdown. But I want to leave you with this final, highly provocative question posed directly by the text. If religion is just a localized societal invention, like those 19th century sociologists claimed, how do you explain the exact same concept of a supreme creator appearing organically across almost every single isolated civilization, distinct geography, and era of human history? It's a pretty powerful thought to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the ideas.